What would you do if the only family you've ever known was suddenly at risk of being taken away? Today's story is about a young boy named Joshua who faces a heart-wrenching battle that will decide his future. Raised by Michael, the only father he's ever known, Joshua's world is thrown into chaos when a long-lost biological relative steps forward to claim custody. In the midst of this legal struggle, a letter from Joshua's late mother surfaces, holding a powerful secret that could change everything. But will it be enough to keep Joshua and Michael together? Or will blood ties and family rights tear them apart? As the story unfolds, you'll witness moments of deep love, devastating heartbreak, and unexpected redemption as all parties fight for what they believe is best for Joshua. But whose version of family will prevail? Before we dive in, let us know in the comments. What does family mean to you? If you're ready for a story filled with emotional highs and lows, be sure to hit the subscribe button and click the bell so you don't miss the heartwarming conclusion to Joshua's journey. The sun broke gently through the curtains of the modest suburban home, casting a warm glow across the small, neatly kept bedroom. In the bed, a boy of 10 stirred, his dark brown hair tousled from sleep. Joshua Carter blinked, still drowsy, as he rubbed his eyes. The smell of pancakes drifted from the kitchen, waking him fully. A smile tugged at the corners of his mouth. Today would be a good day. He could feel it. Downstairs, the sounds of breakfast being made filled the house. Michael Thompson, Joshua's foster father, moved efficiently around the kitchen. His face was one of quiet concentration, but his eyes sparkled with affection as he thought of the boy who would soon be bounding down the stairs. This was their ritual, and Michael cherished these moments. The sound of small footsteps thudding down the stairs brought a smile to Michael's face. "Morning, Dad," Joshua said, his voice still sleepy but warm. He slid into his usual seat at the kitchen table. Michael turned from the stove, flipping the last pancake onto a plate. "Morning, Josh. Ready for the best pancakes this side of the city?" he asked with a playful grin, setting the plate down in front of Joshua. Joshua laughed, shaking his head. "You say that every time." "That's because it's true every time," Michael replied, ruffling the boy's hair affectionately. They ate in companionable silence for a moment, the kind of silence shared by people who knew each other deeply. Joshua had been living with Michael since he was a toddler, after his biological mother, Sarah, had passed away. Though they were not connected by blood, their bond was undeniable. Joshua wiped syrup from his chin and looked at Michael, his eyes thoughtful. "Dad, can we go to the park after school today? I want to practice baseball." Michael smiled softly, always ready to encourage Joshua's love for the game. "Of course. We'll head there right after you finish your homework." Joshua grinned and shoved the last bite of pancake into his mouth. "Awesome!" The phone rang, breaking the peaceful moment. Michael's smile faltered as he wiped his hands on a dish towel, crossing the room to answer the call. As soon as he heard the voice on the other end, his face changed, his eyes darkening with concern. Joshua watched curiously, sensing the shift in Michael's mood. "I understand," Michael said quietly into the phone. His gaze flicked to Joshua, who was still finishing breakfast, blissfully unaware of the weight of the conversation. "I'll be there this afternoon," Michael said before hanging up. Joshua tilted his head. "Everything okay?" Michael plastered on a reassuring smile, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "Everything's fine, Josh. Just some paperwork I need to handle." Joshua shrugged, accepting the answer. He trusted Michael implicitly. He had never given him any reason not to. As Michael cleared the table, his mind raced. The phone call had been from his lawyer, Angela Phillips, and it wasn't good news. There was trouble brewing, and it threatened the world he had built with Joshua. Later that day, as Joshua sat in his classroom, completely absorbed in his math problems, Michael sat across from Angela in her small, tidy office. Her face was serious as she handed him an envelope with a neatly printed address. "This came in yesterday," she said, her voice calm but grave. "It's a notice of intent to file for custody." Michael stared at the envelope in his hands, a pit forming in his stomach. He didn't have to open it to know what it meant. He had been dreading this for years, ever since Sarah passed away, and he had taken Joshua in. "Who's filing?" he asked, his voice tight. Angela hesitated, her expression sympathetic. "Joshua's biological grandfather, Thomas Evans." Michael's head snapped up. shock and disbelief flooding his chest. Thomas? I didn't even know he was still... He hasn't had any contact in all these years. Why now? Angela sighed, leaning forward slightly. Apparently he's claiming that he wasn't aware of Joshua's situation until recently. He says he wants to take over raising Joshua, citing that he's the only living blood relative. Michael felt the air leave his lungs. Blood relative. That was the one thing he couldn't compete with. No matter how much he loved Joshua, no matter how many years they had spent together, he wasn't Joshua's biological family. I've been his father for almost his entire life, Michael whispered, his voice shaking slightly. I've raised him, loved him. How can someone just come in after all these years and... Angela reached out, resting a hand on his arm. I know this is hard, but the courts will favor blood relations if they think it's in the child's best interest. You've done everything right, Michael, but this is going to be a fight. Michael gritted his teeth, his mind racing. He couldn't imagine his life without Joshua. The thought of losing him to someone who had never been there, someone who didn't know him the way Michael did, was unbearable. Joshua doesn't even know Thomas, Michael said, his voice rising slightly with frustration. He hasn't been around. How can he think he has the right to just take him away? Angela nodded sympathetically. We'll fight this, Michael, but we need to be prepared. Thomas is wealthy, and he'll likely bring in a strong legal team. We need to gather everything we can to show that you've been a stable, loving presence in Joshua's life. Michael sat back, running a hand through his hair. Where do we start? School records, testimonials from teachers, neighbors, friends. Anything that shows you've provided Joshua with a nurturing environment, Angela said. We'll need to build a strong case. Michael nodded, though the weight of the situation pressed heavily on him. He couldn't let Joshua be taken away. He wouldn't. That evening, as Michael and Joshua walked through the park, the boy's laughter filled the air as he tossed a baseball back and forth with his foster father. The sun dipped low on the horizon, casting a warm golden light over the field. Joshua, still blissfully unaware of the battle brewing in the background, was as happy as he could be. Michael watched Joshua chase after the ball, his heart swelling with pride and love. He had watched Joshua grow from a small, quiet child into a bright, energetic boy with an infectious smile and a heart full of kindness. How could anyone believe that Joshua wasn't exactly where he belonged? Dad! Joshua's voice pulled him from his thoughts. Check this out. Michael smiled, nodding as Joshua demonstrated his best pitching stance. For a moment, all the worries about the court case and Thomas faded away. This was what mattered to the simple, joyful moments they shared. But as they headed home, Michael's heart grew heavier. Soon he would have to tell Joshua about the custody battle. He had to prepare him for the possibility that things might change. That night, after tucking Joshua into bed, Michael stood in the doorway of his room, watching him sleep. The boy's face was peaceful, his breathing steady. Michael clenched his fists at his sides, a silent vow forming in his heart. He would fight for Joshua with everything he had. No matter what Thomas Evans or the courts thought, he was Joshua's father. He had raised him, cared for him, and loved him every single day. And he wasn't about to let anyone take that away. Joshua leaned against the window of his classroom, watching the raindrops race each other down the glass. He'd finished his math problems early, something he was particularly proud of, and now he had some quiet time to let his mind wander. Usually his thoughts drifted to baseball or the games he'd play with his friends after school, but today his mind felt heavy. Something was wrong, though Joshua couldn't quite put his finger on it. His dad, Michael, had been different the past few days, quieter, distracted. Joshua had caught him staring off into space more than once, his brow furrowed in that way that always made Joshua's stomach twist. The bell rang, pulling him from his thoughts. The classroom erupted in noise as students began packing their things, ready to leave. Joshua grabbed his backpack and hurried to the door, eager to see Michael and get home. But when he stepped outside, he didn't see the familiar sight of Michael's truck waiting for him. Instead, Mrs. Emily Johnson, their kind elderly neighbor, stood there, holding an umbrella and smiling warmly. "Hi, Josh," Mrs. Johnson said, waving him over. "Your dad asked me to pick you up today. He's taking care of something important." Joshua's face fell slightly, though he tried to hide it. Oh, okay. Mrs. Johnson's smile softened as she took Joshua's hand and led him to her car. He'll be home soon, I'm sure. Come on, let's get you out of the rain. As they drove through the quiet streets, Joshua's mind raced. What was so important that Michael couldn't pick him up from school? Michael always made sure to be there, no matter what. Joshua couldn't shake the feeling that something was changing, and he didn't like it. When they arrived home, Mrs. Johnson gave Joshua a quick hug and patted his head. You're such a good boy, Josh. Your dad's lucky to have you. She smiled, though her eyes were filled with a strange kind of sadness that Joshua didn't understand. Thanks, Mrs. Johnson, Joshua muttered, waving as she drove off. He stood in the driveway for a moment, staring at the house. Normally it felt warm and welcoming, but today something about it felt different. He pushed open the front door and kicked off his shoes. The house was eerily quiet. Dad, he called out, his voice echoing in the hallway. Michael appeared a moment later, a forced smile on his face. Hey, buddy. Sorry about Mrs. Johnson picking you up today. Joshua shrugged, his stomach nodding. It's fine, but is everything okay? Michael hesitated, just for a moment, but Joshua saw it. He always saw it. Everything's fine, Josh. I just had to take care of something. Why don't you get started on your homework, and I'll get dinner ready? Joshua nodded slowly, but as he walked to his room, his mind kept circling back to the question he hadn't asked. What's really going on? Later that evening, after a quiet dinner, Michael sat in the living room, the glow of the television casting soft light across the room. Joshua had gone to bed, but Michael's mind was far from peaceful. He kept running over the conversation with Angela from earlier that day, her words ringing in his ears. Courts favor blood relatives, especially if they're stable and financially secure. You need to be ready for a tough battle. Michael sighed, leaning forward and resting his head in his hands. He had known this day might come. Ever since Sarah had passed, he had feared that someone from Joshua's biological family might step forward. But not after all this time. Not after he had built a life with Joshua, a life filled with love and laughter. The phone buzzed on the coffee table, pulling him from his thoughts. He picked it up, seeing Angela's name on the screen. Michael, her voice was soft but firm. We need to meet again tomorrow. There's something new I want to discuss. Michael's heart sank. What is it? I spoke with Thomas's lawyer, Angela said, hesitating for just a moment. They're going to push hard on the argument that Joshua needs to be with his biological family. Thomas is claiming that he's ready to provide everything Joshua needs. A better school, financial security, all of it. Michael clenched his jaw. Joshua doesn't care about money. He's happy here. I know that, Michael, Angela said, her voice gentle. But the courts don't always see it that way. We need to focus on the emotional bond between you and Joshua. That's our strongest defense. Michael leaned back on the couch, staring at the ceiling. He's my son, Angela. I've been his father for years. How can they even consider taking him away from me? Angela sighed softly. We'll do everything we can. I promise. After hanging up, Michael sat in the darkened living room, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. He had to protect Joshua. He couldn't lose him. The next morning, Joshua sat at the breakfast table, pushing his cereal around with his spoon. The atmosphere in the house had been strange for days, and it was starting to get to him. Michael was quieter than usual, more distant. Joshua had noticed the worried looks and the hushed phone calls late at night. Something was definitely wrong. Dad? Joshua asked, breaking the silence. Michael glanced up from the newspaper, his face tired but kind. Buddy? Joshua hesitated, unsure how to phrase what he was feeling. Is something going on? You've been acting weird. Michael's face softened, though a flicker of pain crossed his eyes. He put down the newspaper and leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. Joshua, there's something I need to talk to you about. Joshua's heart skipped a beat, fear creeping into his chest. He stared at Michael, waiting for him to continue. There's going to be a legal thing happening soon, Michael said carefully, choosing his words. Someone from your biological family, your grandfather, wants to take over raising you. Joshua's stomach dropped. Take over? Raising me? He echoed, his voice barely above a whisper. Michael nodded, his face tight with emotion. He's your biological grandfather, but he's never been in your life before. I don't want you to worry, okay? I'm going to fight for you. I'm going to make sure you stay right here with me." Joshua's mind reeled. He didn't know much about his biological family. He knew his mom, Sarah, had died when he was little, but he had never thought about anyone else. Michael had always been his dad, his only family. "Why would he want to take me away?" Joshua asked, his voice trembling. Michael reached across the table, taking Joshua's hand in his. "I don't know, Josh, but I do know this. You're my son, and I love you more than anything. I'm not going to let anyone take you away from me." Joshua blinked rapidly, trying to hold back the tears that were threatening to spill. He didn't want to understand. All he knew was that the idea of leaving Michael, of leaving the only home he had ever known, was too much to bear. "Is he going to win?" Joshua whispered. Michael squeezed his hand tightly. We're a family, Josh, and families stick together." The days leading up to the first court hearing were a blur for Michael. He spent hours gathering paperwork, meeting with Angela, and preparing his case. Each day brought more stress, more fear that he wasn't doing enough. Meanwhile, Joshua grew quieter. He still went to school, still played baseball with his friends, but there was a distance in his eyes, a shadow that hadn't been there before. The fear of the unknown had settled in, and no matter how many times Michael reassured him, Joshua couldn't shake the feeling that his world was about to change. One evening, as Michael helped Joshua with his math homework, the boy finally broke down. "Why is this happening?" Joshua asked, tears streaming down his face. "I don't want to leave, Dad. I don't want to go with him." Michael pulled Joshua into a tight hug, his own eyes misting with unshed tears. "I know, buddy. I know. And I'm going to do everything I can to make sure that doesn't happen." Joshua buried his face in Michael's chest, his body shaking with sobs. "Why doesn't he just leave us alone? We're happy. Why does he have to ruin everything?" Michael's heart ached at the pain in Joshua's voice. He wished he had an answer, but he didn't. All he could do was hold his son and promise him over and over that they would get through this together. As they sat there, holding each other in the quiet of the living room, Michael's resolve hardened. He would fight for Joshua. No matter how long it took, no matter how hard it became, he would fight, because Joshua was his son, and no one could take that away. The day Joshua met Thomas Evans for the first time was cold and gray, the kind of day that made everything feel heavier. Michael had been dreading this moment for weeks, but Angela had insisted that it was necessary for the case. To supervise a meeting between Joshua and his biological grandfather. It was part of the legal process, an attempt to prove that Thomas was trying to build a relationship with Joshua. Michael sat beside Joshua in the waiting room of the small office where the meeting would take place. Joshua stared down at his hands, picking at the edge of his jacket, his face pale with worry. He hadn't said much on the drive over, and now the silence between them was thick and uncomfortable. "Josh," Michael said softly, leaning down to look at him. "You don't have to be scared. I'm right here, okay? No one's going to take you anywhere today." Joshua nodded, but his eyes didn't meet Michael's. He wasn't sure what to expect. The idea of meeting this man, this stranger, who was supposed to be his family, felt strange, even wrong. He didn't want a new family. He didn't need one. He had Michael, and that was enough. The door opened, and a woman stepped out, clipboard in hand. "Joshua, we're ready for you." Joshua's stomach twisted, and he hesitated. Michael squeezed his shoulder. "I'll be right here, buddy. You've got this." Joshua swallowed hard and stood up, his legs feeling shaky as he followed the woman down the hall. He didn't know what to expect, but whatever was waiting for him in that room, he wasn't ready. When they entered, the first thing Joshua saw was a tall, gray-haired man sitting at a small table. He was dressed in a crisp suit, his posture stiff, his expression unreadable. His eyes, though, they were the same color as Joshua's, and for a moment, that realization made Joshua feel uneasy. "Joshua," the man said, his voice deep but not unkind. "I'm Thomas." Your grandfather Joshua stood frozen, unsure of what to do or say. This man didn't feel like family. He felt like a stranger, and the way he looked at Joshua, as if he was trying to figure him out, made the boy's skin crawl. The woman who had led Joshua in motioned for him to sit down across from Thomas. Joshua hesitated but eventually sat, his back rigid, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. For a moment neither of them spoke. The silence in the room was deafening, and Joshua wished more than anything that he was back home with Michael, where everything felt safe and familiar. Thomas cleared his throat. "I know this is probably a lot for you to take in. Meeting me like this, I mean." Joshua didn't respond. He wasn't sure what to say. What was he supposed to feel? Gratitude, curiosity? He felt none of those things. All he felt was a deep, uncomfortable sense of wrongness. "I know I wasn't there for your mother," Thomas continued, his voice faltering slightly. "I made mistakes, but I'm here now, and I want to make things right. I want to be part of your life." Joshua's hands clenched tighter in his lap. "Why?" he asked, his voice small and uncertain. "Why now?" Thomas sighed, his face softening. "Because I lost my daughter, your mother, and I don't want to lose you too. I know I should have been there for her when she was alive, and I wasn't. But I'm here now, and I want to take care of you. I can give you things, opportunities, a future." Joshua shook his head, feeling the sting of tears in his eyes. "I don't want that. I don't want you. I just want to stay with my dad." Thomas's face tightened at Joshua's words, but he didn't argue. "I understand you're scared. I'm not trying to take you away from everything you... I'm trying to give you something better." Joshua stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "I don't need something better. I have everything I need. I have my dad." With that, Joshua turned and bolted from the room, tears spilling down his cheeks. He didn't stop running until he found Michael, sitting in the waiting room just as he had promised. Joshua threw himself into Michael's arms, sobbing into his chest. Michael held him close, his heart breaking as he whispered, "It's okay, Josh. I've got you. I'm right here." Later that night, after Joshua had finally fallen asleep, Michael sat alone at the kitchen table, staring down at the cup of coffee he didn't intend to drink. His mind raced with everything Joshua had told him about the meeting with Thomas, the way he had tried to convince Joshua that he needed a better life, that he could give him more than Michael ever could. Anger surged through Michael's chest, hot and bitter. How could Thomas think he could just walk into Joshua's life after all these years and act like he knew what was best for him? He didn't know Joshua. He didn't know how hard it had been when Sarah died, how much Michael had sacrificed to give Joshua a stable, loving home. Michael had been there for Joshua's first words, his first steps. He kissed every scraped knee, wiped away every tear. He had sat up with him through countless nights of nightmares and sickness, had cheered for him at every school play and baseball game. And now Thomas thought he could just come in and take all of that away. Michael stood up abruptly, his hands gripping the edge of the counter as he fought to calm himself. He couldn't afford to lose control now, not with the court hearing coming up. He had to stay focused, had to keep fighting for Joshua. But the fear lingered, gnawing at the edges of his resolve. What if the courts didn't care about all of that? What if they only cared about the fact that Thomas was Joshua's biological family? Could they really take his son away from him? Michael shook his head, forcing the thought from his mind. He couldn't let himself think like that. He had to believe that the court would see the truth, that love, not blood, was what made a family. He turned off the kitchen light and headed to bed. His mind is still heavy with worry, but as he stood in the doorway of Joshua's room, watching his son sleep peacefully, Michael made a silent vow. No matter what happened, he wouldn't let anyone take Joshua from him. He would fight until there was nothing left to fight for. The courtroom was cold and imposing, the kind of place that seemed designed to make people feel small. Michael sat at the table beside Angela, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. Across the room sat Thomas, his lawyer, Richard Hamilton, flipping through a stack of papers with practiced ease. The room was filled with murmured conversations, the shuffling of papers, and the distant click of shoes against the hard floor. Joshua sat next to Michael, his face pale and drawn. He looked smaller than usual, his eyes darting nervously around the room. Michael placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder, but it did little to ease the tension that hung in the air. The judge, Ellen Williams, entered the room, and everyone rose to their feet. She was an older woman with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. As she took her seat, the room fell silent, the weight of the moment settling over everyone. "We are here today in the matter of Evans versus Thompson, a custody case concerning Joshua Carter." Judge Williams began, her voice steady and firm. I expect all parties to conduct themselves with respect and decorum. Let us proceed. Richard Hamilton was the first to speak, his voice smooth and confident. He laid out Thomas's case with precision, emphasizing the importance of blood ties and the opportunities Thomas could provide for Joshua. Better schools, financial security, a stable home environment. The child belongs with his family, Richard said, his voice carrying across the room. Mr. Evans is Joshua's biological grandfather, and he is prepared to offer him everything he needs for a better future. Angela stood up next, her expression calm but fierce. She spoke of the life Michael had built for Joshua, the love and care he had given him since he was a toddler. She presented school records, letters from teachers, and testimony from neighbors who had witnessed firsthand the bond between Michael and Joshua. Joshua has grown up in a home filled with love and stability, Angela said, her voice strong. He has thrived under Michael's care, and to take him away now would cause him irreparable harm. Throughout the proceedings, Joshua sat quietly, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. He listened as strangers talked about his life as if it were a math equation. This plus that equals a better future. But none of them seemed to understand that the only future Joshua wanted was one where he stayed with Michael. As the day wore on, Joshua's anxiety grew. He couldn't stop thinking about the meeting with Thomas, the way the man had talked about opportunities and a better life, as if those things could replace the love and security he had with Michael. By the time the hearing ended for the day, Joshua was exhausted, both physically and emotionally. He clung to Michael's side as they left the courthouse, his mind spinning with everything that had happened. What if they take me away? Joshua asked, his voice small and fearful. Michael knelt down in front of him, his hands resting on Joshua's shoulders. They won't, Josh. I'm not going to let that happen. But as they walked to the car, the weight of uncertainty pressed down on both of them. No matter how much Michael wanted to believe his own words, the truth was, he didn't know what the court would decide. The next few weeks were a blur of court hearings, meetings with lawyers, and endless paperwork. The strain of the custody battle weighed heavily on both Michael and Joshua. Their once happy home now felt tense and uncertain, the fear of what might happen looming over them like a dark cloud. Joshua became quieter, retreating into himself as the court case dragged on. He no longer asked to go to the park after school or begged Michael to play catch in the backyard. Instead, he spent most of his time in his room, trying to distract himself with homework or video games, but nothing seemed to help. Michael, too, was struggling. The constant pressure of the court case, combined with his fear of losing Joshua, left him exhausted and on edge. He tried to keep things as normal as possible for Joshua's sake, but the cracks in their world were starting to show. One night, as Michael sat on the couch, staring blankly at the television, Joshua came and sat beside him, resting his head on Michael's shoulder. I don't want to go with him, Dad, Joshua whispered. I don't care if he's my grandfather. I just want to stay with you. Michael wrapped an arm around Joshua, pulling him close. I know, Josh. I know. And I'm going to do everything I can to make sure you stay right here with me. They sat together in the quiet of the living room, the weight of the world pressing down on both of them. But in that moment, as they held each other close, Michael made a silent vow to himself. No matter how long it took, no matter how hard it got, he would fight for Joshua. Because Joshua was his son, and no one could take that away. Another court session was set to begin, and the air inside the courtroom felt heavier than usual. Michael sat beside Angela, his hands clasped tightly together. Joshua was at school today. Michael had decided it was best for him to stay away from this particular session, to shield him from more of the legal wrangling that seemed to go on forever. Thomas sat across the room, his expression as stoic as ever, but Michael could see the tension in his face. The custody battle was taking its toll on everyone. Judge Ellen Williams entered the room and the session began. It followed the same rhythm as all the others, each side presenting their case, discussing Joshua's best interests, questioning who could provide a better life for him. But something about today felt different, as if a shift was coming. Midway through the proceedings, Angela stood up, holding a folder in her hands. Her face was calm but determined. Your Honor, Angela began, her voice carrying across the room. We have new evidence that we believe is crucial to this case. Judge Williams raised an eyebrow. New evidence? Angela nodded and handed the folder to the bailiff, who passed it to the judge. This is a letter written by Sarah Carter, Joshua's biological mother, before her death. It outlines her wishes regarding Joshua's upbringing. Thomas, sitting at his lawyer's table, frowned, his brow furrowed. Michael held his breath as the judge opened the folder and began reading the letter. The room fell into a tense silence as everyone waited. The judge's eyes scanned the page, her expression neutral at first. But as she read further, her face softened, and Michael saw a flicker of something in her eyes. Something that gave him hope. Your Honor, this letter was written when Sarah knew her time was short, Angela continued. In it, she expresses her clear and unequivocal wish that Michael Thompson be the one to raise Joshua. Judge Williams finished reading and set the letter down on her desk. She folded her hands, her expression thoughtful. Mr. Hamilton, Judge Williams said, addressing Thomas's lawyer, do you have any objections to the introduction of this letter? Richard Hamilton, who had been whispering with Thomas, stood up. Your Honor, while we acknowledge the letter's authenticity, we believe it doesn't change the fact that Mr. Evans is Joshua's biological family. The judge nodded. Noted. She turned her gaze to Angela. Would you care to elaborate further? Angela nodded. Yes, Your Honor. The letter goes beyond just naming Michael Thompson as Joshua's guardian. It speaks to the emotional bond between Sarah, Michael, and Joshua. Sarah trusted Michael to raise her son because she knew he would provide the love and care that Joshua needed. She may not have had wealth or a large family, but she had faith in the strength of the bond between Michael and Joshua. Michael sat quietly, his heart pounding, as Angela continued to speak. He had known about the letter for years. Sarah had given it to him before she passed, telling him that it was her final wish for Joshua's future. He had never imagined it would become the key to keeping his family together. As Angela finished her argument, the courtroom was silent, the weight of the letter hanging in the air. Michael glanced over at Thomas, whose face had gone pale. He looked shaken, as though the reality of what the letter represented was sinking in. After the letter was introduced, Judge Williams called for a short recess to review its contents more thoroughly. As people filed out of the courtroom, Michael stayed in his seat, his mind racing. He felt a flicker of hope that hadn't been there before. Maybe this letter, Sarah's words, could be the turning point they needed. Angela sat down beside him, her expression calm but determined. This is big, Michael. This letter speaks volumes about Sarah's intentions. It's clear she wanted you to be the one to raise Joshua. Michael nodded, though his hand still shook slightly. Do you think it'll be enough? Angela sighed. It's hard to say. The court still has to consider all the evidence. But this letter is powerful. It could tip the scales in our favor. Across the room, Thomas stood near the door, his back to Michael. He was speaking quietly to Richard, his face still pale, his shoulders tense. For the first time, Michael saw something in Thomas that hadn't been there before. Uncertainty. After a moment, Thomas turned and looked directly at Michael. There was no anger in his eyes this time, only something that looked like regret. The two men locked eyes for a long moment before Thomas finally turned and left the room without a word. When the court reconvened, the atmosphere was different. The introduction of Sarah's letter had shifted the dynamic in the room, and everyone could feel it. Michael sat beside Angela, his heart racing as Judge Williams addressed the court. I have reviewed the letter submitted by the petitioner, and I must say it is a compelling piece of evidence, the judge began. While the court must consider the importance of biological family ties, we also must give weight to the wishes of the child's deceased parent, especially when those wishes were made with the child's best interest at heart. Michael's hands clenched tightly in his lap, his eyes fixed on the judge as she continued to speak. The letter makes it clear that Sarah Carter intended for Michael Thompson to raise Joshua. She expressed a deep trust in his ability to provide the love and stability that Joshua needs. This, coupled with the evidence we have already heard regarding the bond between Michael and Joshua, leads me to believe that there is more to this case than just biology. Thomas shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his eyes downcast as the judge spoke. Michael couldn't help but feel a small surge of triumph. Finally, someone was seeing the truth. Someone recognized the love and bond that had been built over the years. However, Judge Williams continued, her tone serious, this does not mean the court can disregard Mr. Evans's rights as a biological relative. We must strike a balance between respecting the wishes of the deceased and ensuring that Joshua's future is secure and stable. Michael's heart sank slightly at those words. He knew what was coming next. The court wasn't ready to rule completely in his favor. Therefore, the judge said, her voice firm, I am granting temporary custody of Joshua to Michael Thompson, pending further review. Mr. Evans will be given supervised visitation rights during this period. The court will reconvene in 2 months to assess Joshua's well-being and the progress of these arrangements. Michael let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. It wasn't the full victory he had hoped for, but it was something. He still had Joshua, at least for now. Thomas stood, his face pale but composed. He gave Michael a brief nod before turning to leave the courtroom, Richard following closely behind. Michael watched them go, his emotions a tangled mix of relief and apprehension. He had won this round, but the battle was far from over. That evening after the court ruling, Michael and Joshua sat together on the couch, the soft hum of the television playing in the background. But neither of them was paying attention to the show. Joshua's face was drawn and pale, his eyes filled with worry. Dad? Joshua said softly, breaking the silence. Yeah, buddy, Michael replied, his voice gentle. Joshua hesitated, his hands fidgeting with the edge of his shirt. Am I going to have to go live with him? With Thomas? Michael's heart ached at the fear in his son's voice. He reached over and pulled Joshua close, wrapping an arm around him. No, Josh, you're staying right here with me. The judge just wants to make sure everything is okay. But I'm going to do everything I can to make sure you stay right where you belong. Joshua nodded, but Michael could see the worry still etched on his face. The uncertainty of the court's decision had taken its toll on him, and it was clear that Joshua was struggling to process everything that was happening. Do you miss her? Joshua asked suddenly, his voice barely above a whisper. Michael's throat tightened. He knew Joshua was talking about Sarah, his biological mother. Michael had always tried to keep Sarah's memory alive for Joshua, to make sure he knew how much she had loved him, even though she hadn't been able to stay. I do, Michael said softly. I miss her every day, but I know she would be proud of you, Josh. She would be so proud of the person you've become. Joshua's lip quivered, and he wiped at his eyes. Do you think she would want me to stay with you? Michael's heart clenched. He nodded, his voice thick with emotion. I know she would, Josh. She chose me to take care of you because she trusted me. She knew how much I loved you, and she wanted us to be together. Joshua let out a small sob and buried his face in Michael's chest. I don't want to go with him. I don't even know him. Michael held him tightly, his own tears slipping down his cheeks. I know, buddy. I know. And I promise you I'm going to fight with everything I have to make sure that doesn't happen. They sat together for a long time, holding each other as the weight of the world pressed down on them. But in that moment, Michael knew one thing for certain. No matter how hard it got, no matter what the court decided, he would never stop fighting for his son. Weeks passed since the court had granted temporary custody to Michael. On the surface, things appeared calm, but beneath the quiet, a storm brewed. Joshua's behavior at school began to change. Once cheerful and engaged, he now sat quietly, his mind far away from his math problems and recess games. His teacher, Mrs. Roberts, noticed the shift but didn't say anything at first, thinking it might just be a phase. One day during a group activity, Joshua snapped at one of his friends. It wasn't anything major, a disagreement over who should take the next turn, but his outburst startled everyone, including Mrs. Roberts. Joshua's hands trembled as he realized he'd shouted. He immediately apologized, but the incident left a heavy cloud over him. That afternoon when Michael picked Joshua up from school, he noticed the silence. It wasn't the usual quiet where Joshua daydreamed about baseball or video games. It was the kind of silence that carried weight. How was school today? Michael asked, trying to keep his voice light. Joshua shrugged, staring out the window. It was fine. Michael's hands tightened on the steering wheel. He wanted to push, to ask Joshua what was really going on, but he knew better. Joshua had been through enough lately. He didn't need another interrogation. Instead, Michael waited, hoping that Joshua would open up when he was ready. But deep down, he feared that the battle for custody was taking more of a toll on Joshua than either of them realized. Meanwhile, Thomas Evans sat in his lawyer's office, staring at the stack of papers in front of him. His lawyer, Richard Hamilton, was talking, explaining their next steps in the case, but Thomas wasn't really listening. All he could think about was the look on Joshua's face during their brief, supervised visits. The boy had barely spoken to him, had kept his distance, and every time Thomas tried to reach out, Joshua flinched as if he were a stranger. Because to Joshua, that's exactly what he was. Thomas leaned back in his chair, rubbing a hand over his face. He had entered this fight believing he was doing the right thing, believing that, as Joshua's only living biological relative, it was his responsibility to take care of him. But now, after seeing the boy's fear and reluctance, Thomas wasn't so sure anymore. "I've lost so much already," Thomas murmured, more to himself than to his lawyer. Richard paused, frowning slightly. "What was that?" Thomas sighed, sitting forward. "I lost my daughter, Richard. I wasn't there for her when she needed me. I thought that by fighting for Joshua, I could make up for that. But now I'm starting to wonder if I'm just making things worse." Richard's brow furrowed, but he didn't respond immediately. Instead, he flipped through the papers on his desk, considering his next words carefully. "Thomas," Richard began, his voice measured, "you came to me because you believed Joshua needed to be with his family. And legally, you're right. But if you're having second thoughts, now's the time to speak up." Thomas stared at the floor for a long moment. The truth was, he didn't know what was right anymore. He had spent years trying to bury his guilt over Sarah's death. Guilt for not being there when she needed him most. And now in his attempt to make amends, he feared he was repeating the same mistakes all over again. "I don't know, Richard," Thomas said quietly. "I just don't know anymore." At home, Joshua's emotions continued to spiral. He had always been a strong kid, but this custody battle was wearing him down in ways he couldn't explain. Every night, he lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling, wondering if the court would decide to send him away. Michael did his best to reassure him, but even Michael's words felt hollow sometimes. What if the court didn't care about how much Michael loved him? What if all they cared about was blood and family ties? One evening, after another long day of court proceedings, Joshua finally broke down. He had been trying to focus on his homework, but the words on the page blurred, and he felt his chest tighten. Tears welled up in his eyes, and before he could stop himself, he let out a loud sob. Michael, who had been in the kitchen making dinner, rushed to his side. "Josh, what's wrong?" Joshua shook his head, wiping furiously at his eyes. "I just can't do this anymore." Michael knelt down beside him, his heart breaking as he pulled Joshua into his arms. "Hey, it's okay, buddy. I'm right here." But Joshua wasn't calming down this time. He cried harder, his small body trembling with the force of it. "What if they take me away?" he sobbed. "What if I have to go live with him? I don't want to go. I don't want to leave you, Dad." Michael held him tightly, his own eyes filling with tears. "They won't take you away, Josh. I promise you, I'm going to fight with everything I've got." Joshua pulled back slightly, looking up at Michael with tear-filled eyes. "But what if it's not enough? What if they don't care?" Michael swallowed hard, knowing he didn't have an answer for that. The truth was, he didn't know what the court would decide. He didn't know if his love for Joshua would be enough in the eyes of the law. But he couldn't let Joshua see that doubt. He had to be strong for both of them. "They will care," Michael said, his voice steady but thick with emotion, "because they'll see what we have. They'll see that we're a family, and that's what really matters." Joshua sniffled, leaning his head against Michael's chest. "I just want this to be over." Michael hugged him tightly, his heart aching. "Me too, buddy. Me too." The day of the final court hearing arrived, and the atmosphere in the courtroom was tense. Michael sat beside Angela, his hands clenched together under the table. Joshua was staying with Mrs. Johnson for the day. Michael didn't want him to be there for this, didn't want him to feel the weight of the court's decision looming over him. Across the room, Thomas sat beside Richard, his face pale but composed. He hadn't spoken to Michael in weeks, not since their last supervised visit. And now, as they waited for the judge's final ruling, the silence between them was heavy. Judge Williams entered the courtroom, and everyone stood. The room fell silent as she took her seat, her eyes scanning the room. "We are here today to deliver the final ruling in the matter of Evans versus Thompson regarding the custody of Joshua Carter," the judge began, her voice steady and firm. "I have reviewed all the evidence presented, including the testimony of both parties, and I have carefully considered the best interests of the child. Michael held his breath, his heart pounding in his chest. This was it, the moment that would determine his and Joshua's future. While the court acknowledges the importance of biological family ties, the judge continued, we must also recognize the emotional bond that has been built between the child and his guardian. Joshua has lived with Mr. Thompson for nearly his entire life. He has thrived under Mr. Thompson's care, and it is clear to the court that a strong, loving bond exists between them. Michael felt a flicker of hope, but he didn't let himself relax just yet. The judge still wasn't finished. However, Judge Williams said, her tone serious, we must also consider Mr. Evans's rights as Joshua's biological relative. Therefore, it is the ruling of this court that full custody of Joshua Carter be granted to Michael Thompson, with regular visitation rights given to Thomas Evans. Michael let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He had won. He had fought for Joshua, and he had won. But the judge wasn't finished. It is my hope, she continued, that both parties can work together to ensure that Joshua has the opportunity to build a relationship with all of the people who care about him. Michael nodded, though his mind was still spinning. He had won custody, but he knew this wasn't the end. There would be visitation, and he would have to find a way to navigate this new reality with Thomas in Joshua's life. As the court session ended, Michael stood, his legs shaky with relief. Angela gave him a small smile, but Michael could tell she was still thinking about what came next. They had won, but the battle wasn't completely over. Across the room, Thomas stood slowly, his face expressionless. He met Michael's eyes for a moment, and for the first time, there was no anger there, only a deep, quiet sadness. Without a word, Thomas turned and left the courtroom. When Michael picked Joshua up from Mrs. Johnson's house that afternoon, he was met with a tight hug from his son. Joshua looked up at him with wide, questioning eyes. Did they say I get to stay with you? Michael knelt down and smiled, pulling Joshua into his arms. Yeah, Josh, you're staying with me. Joshua let out a breath, his whole body relaxing as he buried his face in Michael's shoulder. I'm so glad. Michael held him tightly, his heart full of gratitude and relief. He had fought for Joshua, and they had won. But as they drove home that evening, Michael couldn't help but think about the future. There would be challenges ahead, visits with Thomas, navigating this new reality, but for now, they have each other. And that was enough. The first scheduled visitation with Thomas loomed large in the days following the court's decision. Joshua had been quiet about it, but Michael could see the nervousness in his eyes. They hadn't talked much about what the visits would look like or how Joshua felt about them, and Michael knew better than to push. Still, the tension was there, a quiet but ever-present reminder that their world had changed. Michael and Joshua sat at the kitchen table the morning of the first visit. The clock on the wall ticked loudly, filling the silence. Joshua was pushing his cereal around his bowl, not really eating. Michael could feel the unease radiating from him. You don't have to go if you don't want to, Josh, Michael said gently, breaking the silence. It's just a visit. If you're not ready, I can talk to the court. Explain that it's too soon. Joshua shook his head but didn't look up from his cereal. I'll go. I want to see what he's like, even if I don't want to stay with him. Michael nodded, though a part of him wished Joshua wouldn't go at all. The idea of sharing Joshua, even for a few hours, filled him with dread. But he knew this was part of the agreement, and as much as he hated it, he had to respect the court's decision. Just remember, I'll be right there the whole time, Michael said, trying to sound reassuring. You don't have to do anything you're not comfortable with. Joshua finally looked up, his eyes a little brighter than they had been before. I know, Dad. They drove to the designated meeting spot, a local park with a playground and picnic tables. It was a neutral, open space, meant to make things easier for Joshua. Michael's heart pounded as they pulled into the parking lot. He spotted Thomas sitting on a bench under a tree, looking more nervous than Michael had ever seen him. Joshua hesitated as they approached, his small hand clutching Michael's tightly. Michael knelt down to meet his eyes. I'll be right here, okay? Joshua nodded but didn't let go of Michael's hand. Together they walked toward Thomas, who stood when he saw them coming. He gave Michael a tight nod before turning his attention to Joshua. Hi, Joshua, Thomas said quietly, his voice tentative. I'm glad you came. Joshua didn't say anything at first, his eyes locked on the ground. But after a long pause, he looked up, his voice barely above a whisper. Hi. For a moment, there was an awkward silence, but Michael could see the effort Thomas was making to bridge the gap. He bent down slightly to Joshua's level, softening his tone. I know this is probably weird for you, Thomas said, his voice thick with emotion. But I want you to know, I'm not trying to take you away from your dad. I want to get to know you. Joshua blinked, clearly unsure how to respond. He shifted his weight, glancing back at Michael before finally nodding. Michael stayed close by but gave them space as they sat down at a picnic table. He watched as Thomas tried to make small talk, asking Joshua about school, his favorite subjects, and baseball. At first, Joshua's answers were short, almost mechanical, but slowly he began to open up, just a little. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Over the next few months, the scheduled visitations became a regular part of their lives. At first, Joshua was hesitant, often asking Michael to stay close by during the entire visit. But gradually he became more comfortable, and though the visits were still awkward at times, they started to feel less like a chore. Thomas, for his part, tried hard to connect with Joshua. He brought him small gifts, nothing extravagant, just thoughtful things like a new baseball glove or a book about dinosaurs, knowing Joshua's interests from their conversations. He asked about school, encouraged Joshua in his studies, and attended a few of his baseball games from the sidelines. At one of those games, after Joshua had hit a home run, Thomas clapped and cheered as loudly as Michael. Joshua, for the first time, turned toward him with a smile, a small, tentative one. But it was there. Michael noticed it too, feeling a mixture of pride and discomfort. He knew it was good for Joshua to build a relationship with his biological grandfather, but it was hard to share that role, even in small ways. Later that night, as they drove home, Joshua was uncharacteristically quiet. Michael glanced at him, wondering what was on his mind. You okay, buddy? Michael asked. Joshua nodded but didn't say anything for a moment. Then softly he spoke. He's not that bad. Michael blinked, unsure of how to respond at first. Thomas? Joshua nodded again. Yeah, I mean, he's kind of weird sometimes, but I don't think he's trying to take me away anymore. Michael let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He had been so afraid of what these visits would mean, afraid that Joshua would start to pull away from him, that the bond they had built over the years might be threatened. But hearing Joshua say that brought him a strange sense of relief. He's not, Michael agreed. I think he just wants to get to know you. But no matter what, you and I, nothing changes that, okay? Joshua smiled, the tension eased from his face. One evening, as Michael was cleaning up after dinner, there was a knock at the door. Joshua was upstairs finishing his homework, so Michael went to answer it. When he opened the door, he was surprised to see Thomas standing there, looking hesitant. Thomas, Michael said, his voice guarded. What are you doing here? Thomas shifted uncomfortably. I'm sorry for dropping by unannounced. I wanted to talk to you. Michael frowned but stepped aside, letting him in. They sat down in the living room, the tension between them palpable. I know this whole thing hasn't been easy, Thomas began, his voice quieter than usual. I know I didn't handle it the right way. Michael crossed his arms, waiting for him to continue. When I started this fight, I thought I was doing the right thing, Thomas said, his voice thick with emotion. I thought I was doing what I should have done for Sarah. I wasn't there for her, and I thought fighting for Joshua would somehow make up for that. Michael felt a pang of sympathy, but didn't say anything. But I've realized now that I was wrong, Thomas continued, his eyes misting. You've been his father all these years. You're the one who's raised him, who's been there for him, and I see that now. Michael stared at him, his chest tight with emotion. I'm not asking for forgiveness, Thomas said, his voice cracking. I know I caused a lot of pain, and I can't undo that. But I wanted you to know that I respect what you've done for Joshua. And I'm sorry. For a long moment, the room was silent. Michael's mind raced, 1,000 thoughts swirling in his head. He had spent so much time resenting Thomas for trying to take Joshua away, for disrupting the life they had built. But now, hearing Thomas's genuine apology, he realized that Thomas hadn't been trying to hurt them. He had been trying to heal his own wounds. Michael sighed, running a hand through his hair. You fought hard for him, Thomas. I'll give you that. But I fought too. Because he's my son. Thomas nodded, his eyes filled with understanding. I know, and I see that now. Michael sat back, letting the tension ease from his body. I don't want Joshua to grow up without knowing where he came from. But he needs to know that this is his home. That's the most important thing. Thomas smiled faintly, wiping his eyes. I understand. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was the beginning of something new, something that could lead to healing for all of them. Months passed, and slowly but surely, things began to settle into a new normal. Thomas became a regular part of Joshua's life, attending baseball games, family dinners, and even joining in on holiday celebrations. It was strange at first having him around, but over time, the awkwardness faded, replaced by a quiet understanding. Joshua, for his part, seemed happier. The weight of the custody battle had lifted, and with it, the fear of losing his family. He still referred to Michael as Dad, but now when he talked about Thomas, there was a warmth there that hadn't been present before. One afternoon, as they sat in the backyard, Michael watched Joshua playing catch with Thomas. The two of them laughed as they tossed the ball back and forth, and for the first time, Michael felt a sense of peace. Family comes in many forms, Michael thought, watching them. He had fought so hard to protect his family, to keep it from being torn apart. But now he realized that family wasn't just about keeping people close. It was about letting them in, too. Later that evening, as they sat down for dinner, Joshua looked up at Michael and Thomas, his eyes bright with joy. Are we all a family now? Joshua asked, his voice full of innocence and hope. Michael and Thomas exchanged a look, both smiling. Michael reached over and ruffled Joshua's hair. Buddy, we're all a family. And in that moment, Michael knew that no matter what the future held, they had built something strong, something that could weather any storm. Because at the end of the day, family wasn't just about blood. It was about love and trust and the people who stood by your side, no matter what. As the months turned into years, the pain of the past began to fade, replaced by the warmth of new memories. Joshua grew stronger, more confident, his fear of being taken away long forgotten. He thrived in school, in baseball, and in the love that surrounded him. Thomas remained a part of his life, but never overstepped. He was the grandfather Joshua had never known, but had come to love. Michael remained the steady, unwavering presence he had always been. The man Joshua knew would always be there, no matter what. One summer evening, as the sun set over the horizon, the three of them sat together on the porch. Michael, Joshua, and Thomas. The air was warm, the sound of cicadas humming in the distance. It was a simple moment, but one filled with peace. Joshua looked up at Michael and smiled. I'm glad you're my dad. Michael's heart swelled with emotion. He pulled Joshua close, kissing the top of his head. I'm glad you're my son. And as they sat there, watching the sun dip below the horizon, Michael knew that no matter how their family had come together, no matter the twists and turns that had brought them here, it was exactly where they were meant to be. They were a family, and that was enough. 2 years had passed since the custody battle that had once threatened to tear their lives apart. The seasons had changed, but the bond between Michael, Joshua, and Thomas had only grown stronger, shaped by time, patience, and love. Life was calmer now. No more courtroom visits, no more fears of losing Joshua. What had once been a family defined by uncertainty had transformed into a family defined by unity and acceptance. Joshua had grown taller, his once boyish features giving way to a more confident, determined young boy. He was now a star player on his baseball team, leading them to victories with the same determination that had gotten him through those dark days in court. The fear and uncertainty that had once plagued him had faded, replaced by a deep sense of belonging. It was a bright Saturday morning when they all gathered at the local baseball field. Joshua's team was playing their final game of the season, and the stands were packed with cheering parents. Michael sat in the bleachers, his heart swelling with pride as he watched Joshua take his place on the field, ready to bat. Next to him, Thomas sat, smiling proudly. He no longer wore the stiff suits that had once made him feel distant and formal. Now he was just Grandpa Thomas, dressed in a baseball cap and a casual polo shirt, cheering just as loudly as the other parents. As Joshua stepped up to the plate, bat in hand, he glanced back at the stands. His eyes scanned the crowd until they found Michael. For a moment, their eyes met, and Joshua gave him a small, determined nod. Michael nodded back, silently encouraging him. The pitcher threw the ball, and with a loud crack, Joshua swung. The ball sailed through the air, far beyond the outfield, and the crowd erupted in cheers. Joshua took off running, rounding first base, then second, then third. By the time he reached home plate, his teammates were waiting for him, cheering and clapping him on the back. Michael and Thomas stood, clapping and cheering along with the rest of the crowd. Michael's heart swelled with pride and joy. This was the moment he had fought for, the future he had wanted for Joshua, a life filled with happiness, stability, and the love of those who cared about him. After the game, they all gathered at the park for a celebratory picnic. Joshua, still riding the height of his home run, laughed and played with his friends, his face glowing with happiness. Michael sat back watching him. His heart was full. As the afternoon sun began to dip toward the horizon, Joshua wandered over to where Michael and Thomas were sitting. He plopped down between them, leaning his head on Michael's shoulder. "I'm glad you guys are here," Joshua said quietly, his voice filled with contentment. "We wouldn't miss it for the world, buddy," Michael replied, wrapping an arm around him. Thomas, sitting on the other side, smiled warmly. "You played a great game, Joshua. Your mom would have been proud." Joshua smiled softly at the mention of his mother. "I hope so." For a moment, the three of them sat in comfortable silence, watching the sun set over the park. The air was warm, filled with the sound of laughter and the distant hum of cicadas. It was a perfect evening, simple, peaceful, and filled with love. "Do you think things will always be like this?" Joshua asked after a while, his voice thoughtful. Michael glanced at Thomas, who gave him a small, understanding nod. Then he looked back at Joshua and smiled. "Buddy, I think they will." Joshua closed his eyes, a contented smile on his face. "Good." As the last rays of sunlight faded, Michael felt a deep sense of peace settle over him. The journey they had been on, the battles they had fought, the emotions they had weathered, had led them here, to this moment, to this family. And no matter how they had come together, no matter the pain and challenges they had faced, Michael knew one thing for certain: they were a family, a real family. And that was enough. As the days turned into weeks, and the weeks into years, the bond between Michael, Joshua, and Thomas continued to strengthen. What had once been a fractured family, struggling to find its place, had transformed into something beautiful and unbreakable. They had learned that family wasn't just about blood. It was about love, forgiveness, and the people who stood by you when the world felt uncertain. Michael had kept his promise to Joshua. He had fought for him, had protected him, and now they had the future they had always dreamed of, a future filled with love, laughter, and the knowledge that no matter what, they will always have each other. As the years passed, Joshua grew into a young man, guided by the love of both his father and his grandfather. He knew where he had come from, and he knew where he was going, and most importantly, he knew he was loved. Michael, too, had found peace. The fear of losing Joshua had once haunted him, but now he knew that nothing could break the bond they had. Not the courts, not the battle for custody, and not the fear of the unknown. They had made it through the storm, and now they were stronger for it. And as for Thomas, he had found redemption. He had once thought that fighting for Joshua would heal the wounds left by his daughter's death. But in the end, it wasn't the fight that brought healing. It was the love and acceptance he found in his new role as Joshua's grandfather. It was the family he had gained, not through a courtroom victory, but through forgiveness and the desire to be part of Joshua's life in the way that mattered most. Together, they were a family, and as they faced the future, they knew that, whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. Because in the end, family was everything. If you enjoyed this heartwarming story of family, love, and perseverance, don't miss out on more stories like this. Click subscribe to join our community and never miss an update. Stay tuned for more inspiring and touching stories that will warm your heart. Subscribe now and be part of our journey.